Hello. My name is David Hunter, and I am going to talk a bit about how pilots, and everyone else, make decisions. Before we get started with the discussion of decision making, let me give you just a bit of my background. I have been a pilot for over 40 years, flying both in the military and in general aviation. I am also a psychologist, and for about the last 20 years I have been involved in trying to understand why general aviation pilots have accidents and how to help them be safer. Until I retired from the FAA a few years ago, I was the principal scientist for human performance, and ran a research program aimed at improving safety for GA pilots. Much of what is contained in the presentation is taken from the work I and my colleagues did at the FAA. However, the opinions expressed here are strictly my own, and not those of the FAA. Although the title of this presentation is Aeronautical Decision Making, it could just as well be Automotive Decision Making, Medical Decision Making for golfers, or any of the countless other situations in which people make decisions. Regardless of the setting, the processes and the factors that influence the quality of those processes are essentially the same. The goal of this presentation is to help you understand how decisions are made, in the cockpit and elsewhere, what shapes those decisions, and how you can improve your personal decision making. As we go through the presentation, I think you will see that decision making is a very complex subject that can be looked at from a variety of perspectives. It is rather like the story of the 6 blind men who were asked to determine what an elephant looked like by feeling different parts of the elephant's body. The blind man who feels a leg says the elephant is like a pillar. The one who feels the tail says the elephant is like a rope. The one who feels the trunk says the elephant is like a tree branch. The one who feels the ear says the elephant is like a hand fan. The one who feels the belly says the elephant is like a wall. And the one who feels the tusk says the elephant is like a solid pipe. Of course, they were all right. But the reason every one of them told it differently is because each touched a different part of the elephant. So, actually the elephant has all the features they mentioned. In the same way, there are many different ways of looking at and understanding decision making, and each has something to contribute to our understanding of decision making, both in the cockpit and elsewhere. From the previous slide, it should be evident that this presentation is not just going to talk about hazardous attitudes and the DECIDE model. There is a lot more to decision making than attitudes. So, here is what we will cover. We will start by defining decisions and decision making. Then we will briefly review why decision making is such an important concept in aviation. Next, we will look at what is involved in decision making and some of the factors that can have an impact on this process. Finally, we will review some actions you can take to improve your decision making. Let's start with a discussion of just what we mean by ADM, and decisions in general. The FAA defines ADM as a systematic approach to the mental process used by pilots to determine the best course of action in response to a given set of circumstance. The trouble with that definition is that it is prescriptive, rather than descriptive. That is, it defines what the FAA would like ADM to be, a systematic approach and a best course of action. That is an idealized situation, as opposed to what really happens. Further, systematic approaches and best courses of action may not be the best overall approach to making decisions. For inexperienced pilots, a systematized approach, using, for example, the DECIDE or similar models, may well be the best way to approach decision making. However, expert pilots tend to rely upon a process called recognition prime decision making, in which they almost instantly arrive at a decision, based upon the similarity of the current situation to those they have experienced before. In addition, a decision that satisfies certain basic criteria, safety, efficiency, availability of alternatives, etc., may not be the optimal course of action, but may be entirely satisfactory under the circumstances. In fact, there may be no single best course of action. Flying, and most of life's decisions, is not like picking an investment to give the best rate of return. In that case, arguably there is a single criterion that can be satisfied, making the most money in a given period of time, and the problem is to pick the investment, or set of investments, that maximizes the criterion. However, In most situations there are multiple criteria that need to be considered. For example, when flying, we want to arrive at our destination intact, but we also want to arrive on time, with minimal discomfort due to turbulence, and at a minimum cost. Even with this relatively limited set of criteria, selecting a course of action that optimizes each separate criterion is effectively impossible. Rather, we pick a course of action that generally keeps each criterion within acceptable bounds, and recognizes that some criteria, such as arriving intact, are more important than others. For our purposes, let's consider decision-making as a cognitive process by which we acquire and use information to make choices from among alternatives. We can then look at how that process works, and why it may produce good or not so good choices. As I mentioned with my elephant example, there are many different ways of looking at decisions. At the FAA we talked a lot about what I have called here discrete decisions, decisions such as pressing on into weather, or taking off over gross weight. But, as you can see, there are other ways you can describe decisions. Besides the discrete choice, you can also look at decisions as continuing over a long period of time. For example, after you decide to take off, you must then keep making the decision to continue or divert. You might also look at the purpose of decisions. For example, you could decide that you want to go to some destination on the opposite side of a large body of water. You then have to make a series of tactical decisions about just how to get there. Do you fly over the water to get there, or do you divert along an overland route? Do you try to fly between the thunderstorms? Do you make a lengthy diversion around them, or do you land and wait for them to pass over? Cognitive workload is also an important consideration. Some decisions are fairly well defined, and involve situations that you have faced many times in the past. Decisions of this sort don't usually require a lot of cognitive effort. You simply repeat whatever worked last time. However, occasionally you will run into complex situations that you have not previously encountered, and in those cases you will need to invest a lot of cognitive effort into deciding on a course of action. Everyone agrees that decision-making is important, and that poor decisions contribute to accidents, even if there is some question about the exact percentages. However, we are pretty safe in saying that about a third to a half of fatal accidents are more or less directly attributable to a poor decision or decisions. Because of the importance of decision-making, about 10 years ago the FAA put together a team to look specifically at ADM and its role in GA accidents. The final report from that team, along with the extensive list of suggested interventions to improve ADM, is available, and I have provided a list of web links for this and other documents at the end of this presentation. Let's think about what you need in order to make a decision. First, you need some information about the world around you and how it is put together. For example, you need to know that flying into a cloud will result in your not being able to see the horizon, and that if that happens, then there is a strong probability that you will have trouble maintaining control of the aircraft. You also need a process or system for combining that information to arrive at a decision. For example, you should know where to go for information about the weather, and how to put together the various bits of information about frontal systems, wind speeds, dew points, and visibility to make an informed decisions about the suitability of the weather for flight. When you combine knowledge with a process, you can arrive at a decision. You can think of knowledge as being two types. Technical knowledge, for example what you learned in flight training, and knowledge about what you personally can and will do. Most pilots have good technical knowledge, but are often lacking in knowledge about their personal capabilities and the things that can negatively impact their performance. We will talk more about this problem later. Besides knowledge, you also need a process. Many different processes have been proposed, and they range from very simple to very complex. Here is the process currently being advocated by the FAA. This is a fairly simple model, in which perception leads to a processing of information, which then leads to performance. You might rewrite this model as looking, thinking, and acting. Now, Here is a more complex model that tries to better capture both the decision-making process and the various factors that influence decisions. The center column shows the stages in the decision-making process. The left column is a plain language description of that stage. And the right column lists some of the factors that impact each of the stages. Perception. Similar to the FAA model, we start with perception, taking information from all the senses either directly, or through electronic means. But, in this model we try to list some of the factors that act upon perception and the subsequent processing stages. At the perceptual stage, one factor is attention control. Basically, this means whether we are paying attention to the external stimuli. Think of attention control as the beam of a flashlight that we can shine around the cockpit, illuminating different dials and displays. This is also sometimes called division of attention, and that is an interesting title, since it highlights the notion that you have only a limited amount of attention that must be divided among the various inputs. Applying too much of your attention resource to one display while neglecting another can produce unfortunate consequences. A recreation of the L-1011 crash in the Everglades that featured poor division of attention as one causal factor is available on the web. The link is available at the end of this presentation. Recognition. Once you have acquired some sensory information, you must determine what it is. Recognition of external stimuli is accomplished by comparing the stimuli to the store of information contained in your memories. It is theorized that this takes place primarily by a pattern matching process, in which your brain compares the new stimulus to the vast number of stored patterns to see if it can find a match. If it does, then you are said to recognize the stimulus. For a simple example, if you look out the windshield and see some clouds, then that perceptual stimulus is compared to your memories of clouds to see if you have encountered this stimulus before. Is this a little fair weather cumulus cloud, or is this an anvil-headed thunderstorm? Your brain is really quite good at performing these comparisons and will arrive at an answer amazingly quickly. Experts, pilots with a large and varied store of experiences gained over many years and thousands of hours of flight, will have a very large repertoire of experiences, and can therefore match almost all incoming stimuli to the memory of a similar experience. Technically, this is known as recognition-primed decision-making, and is a characteristic of decision-making among experts in all domains. Unfortunately, those with relatively little experience do not have that vast storehouse of experience to draw from. Therefore, their recognition and decision-making processes are constrained, and we will discuss some of the ways to help novices later in the presentation. Interpretation. Once you have perceived and recognized a situation, you must determine what it means with respect to you. That is, what are the implications of an anvil-shaped thunderstorm for you on this particular flight? Does it present a hazard? How severe is the hazard? Am I willing to expose myself to this hazard by continuing the flight, or do I need to take some action? These sorts of questions, and the answers that you generate, are based primarily on your knowledge of this and similar situations, but also on your personality and your personal level of risk tolerance. This is where attitudes, such as denial and impulsivity, come into play, as they will shape how you interpret the situation. This and the preceding two stages constitute what is termed situation awareness. Situation awareness is the perception of the elements in the environment within a volume of time and space, the comprehension of their meaning, and the projection of their status in the near future. Most problems in situation awareness arise from a failure to perceive the relevant elements in the environment. That is, pilots either don't know where to look or don't recognize what they see, which leads to an accident. Response selection. Some psychologists like to describe the ADM process as consisting of a problem recognition phase and a response selection phase. The problem recognition phase would correspond to the first three stages in this model. We perceive the external stimuli, recognize them, and determine that a problem exists that requires us to make some decision. Picking an appropriate response is the next stage in our ADM process. Picking a response depends on what both we and the aircraft are capable of doing. If you find yourself flying into an area of rising terrain, you might want to climb, but the aircraft might not be capable of climbing at that altitude. Or, you might be flying into deteriorating weather conditions in a fully IFR-capable aircraft, but lack the personal skills needed to maintain safe instrument flight. Unfortunately, personality and risk tolerance get involved in the response selection, such that we tend to overestimate our personal capabilities and underestimate the risks we have encountered. This will also be discussed in greater detail later. Execution. Having identified a problem and determined a response, we must now execute that response. Your current skill levels are the critical components here. To borrow an example from a different domain, consider the golfer who knows the exact distance to the hole from his current position and has a club that he used during the warm-up session to hit the ball that distance. The question is whether he is sufficiently skilled to execute the shot under the current conditions. Even golf pros don't hit the ball perfectly every time, and for amateurs the likelihood of a miss-hit shot landing in the water or the woods is fairly high. Hence, he needs to watch the ball carefully to see where it goes. Evaluation. Watching where the golf ball goes leads us to the final stage of evaluation. Did we get the ball on the green, or do we need to hit it again? Setting our golf clubs aside and getting back in the cockpit, imagine that in response to IFR conditions at our destination airport we decided to execute a non-precision VOR approach. Under the circumstances that may be an appropriate and reasonable decision. However, in reading a lot of accident reports, almost all the decisions leading up to the accident seemed appropriate and reasonable at the time. So, we must be continually vigilant to ensure that our decision is being executed properly and is leading to the outcome we expected. On an instrument approach, the boundary conditions that necessitate a change of plan, such as drifting too far off course, are fairly well defined. In other situations, such as a cross-country flight through mountainous terrain, we may need to set our own boundary conditions and take immediate action if a condition is exceeded. To put it more simply, if you find that you cannot climb and there is a big mountain ahead of you, it is definitely time to do something else, and you really need to have determined that something else much earlier. Besides considering the decision-making processes, we can also look at the styles of decision-making that some people use. First, let's look at how pilots combine information to arrive at a decision. In a study that I and some colleagues conducted a few years ago, we gave pilots imaginary scenarios in which we varied the ceiling, visibility, precipitation, and terrain. Using mathematical modeling, we then examined how they combined the information about those factors when determining how comfortable they felt in making a flight. We found that pilots combine the information in one of two ways. Some pilots treated each factor as a separate hurdle. So, they rated flights as hazardous if any of the variables, visibility, ceiling, or precipitation, were below a certain value. However, other pilots used a compensatory strategy, in which a good value on one variable, such as visibility, made up for a bad value on another variable. For most pilots, especially relatively inexperienced general aviation pilots, using a compensatory decision strategy is much riskier than using the multiple hurdle strategy. Allowing a great ceiling to compensate for a lousy visibility when determining how risky you think a flight will be can put you into significant danger. You are far better off to consider each of these factors independently. So, if the ceiling is low, then you should consider the flight to be risky, even if the visibility is great. Conversely, having a high ceiling will not make up for a low visibility. One style that was identified by researchers at The Ohio State University had to do with the diligence of pilots. Based on observations of pilots flying a demanding flight scenario in a simulator, they found that some pilots tended to make a decision fairly rapidly in response to a problem, such as partial loss of power, and then to take no further action to diagnose the problem or refine their responses. These were called knee-jerk responses, because they were quick, but there was no further effort put forth to validate the original decision. In contrast, some pilots, generally those who were more experienced in general aviation flights, exhibited a very different sort of response to a problem. The initial response of these pilots may have been very similar to that of the knee-jerk pilots, but this group continued to investigate other solutions and to validate their original decision. The next videos contain examples of the sorts of behavior that characterize these two groups. Let me warn you, these are university students on a low budget, so don't expect great acting. Just look at the style of responding modeled by these two pilots.
What was that? Did I lose some power? What happened? Whoop, I lost altitude, lost my heading. Can't seem to figure that out. Well, better figure out what I'm going to do. Let me see. Weather is better to the east. I'm going to head that way. Well, let me see. Weather at my alternate was forecast for VFR. That seems like the easiest solution. I'll just head over there.
Wow, I've lost 500 RPM. I wonder what's going on. I'll go ahead and advance my mixture, my prop, and see if that does anything. I'm holding my altitude and my heading. That's important. I'm going to call ATC. Center, this is Cessna 1400 uniform. I have an unexplained drop in RPM and I might need some assistance. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn the fuel pumps on, switch the tanks and see if that does anything. Okay, that didn't do any good. It's not a fuel problem. Putting the mixture and the prop forward didn't change anything. I don't think this is a catastrophic problem, but I'm going to have to consider an alternate plan. Okay, it appears I have an ill-defined problem. I better start looking at some alternatives. Go ahead and check the weather. It appears the closest airport to me right now is Black Lick, but it doesn't have an instrument approach, and the weather's pretty bad there. Yeah, I am holding altitude and heading. I think I'll call center and see what the conditions are like at Chapel Hill, my destination. Center, this is Cessna 1400 Sierra uniform. Can you give me current weather conditions at Chapel Hill? While he's checking that, I'm going to go ahead and check the mags. No, that doesn't cause anything to change. Roger, Center. 400 overcast, visibility. Thanks a lot. That ceiling doesn't give me much to work with, and I don't really want to have to do a go-around with a bad engine. It's only got a VOR approach. It's night. I'm headed towards mountainous terrain. The weather's getting worse. I think I'm going to look for a better alternative. Well, if not Chapel Hill, I'm going to see what else is out here. I'll take a look at the weather, and I am maintaining altitude and heading while I'm doing this. Look at my chart. Looks like Bentry is directly south of me. That might be good, but it's only got a VOR approach, and the weather's at minimums. I don't really want to have to do a missed approach with an engine problem. I think I'll call center again and check the weather at my alternate. Center, this is Cessna 1400 Sierra uniform. What's the weather like at New Albany? While he's checking that, I'm going to go ahead and try another diagnosis. Well, that RPM drop was pretty quick. I don't think it's carb ice, but I'll go ahead and put carb heat on just to make sure. No, it's not carb ice. Roger Center, weather better than 5005. Thanks a lot. Well, that sounds good, except it's 45 minutes away. But that's going to take me towards better weather and flat terrain. If I go to the closest airport, I might have to do a go-around on a bad engine. I don't want to have to do that. And if the problem worsens, I might be forced to land in mountainous terrain at night. I think I'm headed for New Albany.
We've talked about knowledge, processes, and styles, but we also need to be aware of the overall strategies pilots use. Here are some of the more common strategies that people, and pilots, use when making decisions. Optimizing. Optimizing means that we try to select the course of action with the best payoff. However, while it is theoretically attractive, from a practical standpoint this is a very difficult strategy to follow, since it requires that we have access to reliable, relevant information that covers all the factors influencing the decision. And, we have to have the time in which to carefully consider each and every alternative. While this may be a good approach for a company considering the acquisition of another company, it is really not too practical for pilots, or anyone else involved in a fast-paced dynamic process with limited access to information and limited time to arrive at a decision. Note, however, that this is essentially what the FAA definition of ADM would require. Satisficing. Rather than trying to achieve the absolute best solution with the optimizing strategy, most people tend to use a strategy in which they find a good enough solution and go with that. If a decision generally achieves the goal of getting the plane where you want it to go, while preserving a reasonable level of safety and comfort, then it is probably not a bad solution. This is generally the strategy used by most people in most situations. For example, I rather doubt that many people find the perfect house of their dreams that satisfies absolutely all their wishes. Instead, they pick a house that fits their budget, and has more or less the floor plan they want in a location that is not too far from work. It's not perfect, but it is good enough. Sole decision rule. It could be argued that a lot of what we do in aviation is based on this rule. For example, we generally do what the FAA tells us to. Think of vertical and horizontal separation, minimum descent altitudes, and similar sorts of rules. We also use some fairly hard and fast decisions rules in situations such as rejected takeoff speeds. Taken to an extreme, of course, this can lead to impulsive, poorly considered decisions. Sometimes situations are such that the old rule just will not work, and a good decision maker must recognize when it occurs and be ready to broaden a search for a solution. The catastrophic failure of the hydraulic system on the DC-10 at Sioux City might be an example of such a situation. Selection by elimination. If you can determine what the most important criterion is, then selection by eliminating those alternatives that do not meet the criterion may be an effective strategy. For example, if you are running low on fuel over the ocean, then an alternative that does not allow you to reach dry land may be eliminated immediately. Once you have found a solution that gets you to dry land, then you can apply another criterion, such as reaching an airport capable of handling your aircraft. Obviously, this strategy is not without its drawbacks. For example, you may not be able to find a solution that meets the criterion of reaching dry land, and you will have wasted a lot of time that could have been devoted to finding a nice place to ditch, hopefully next to a Coast Guard cutter. Also, like the optimization strategy, this process can become mentally demanding and does not guarantee that you will find a solution to the prime criterion. Incrementalism. If you think back to our earlier example of a pilot who used progressive decision-making, as opposed to the knee-jerk decision-maker, you might recognize some aspects of incrementalism in that decision-making style. Although the pilot in our example was clearly aware of acquiring information that could be used to make or refine her decision, she clearly took an incremental approach to achieve a better solution to her problem. We've examined many different ways of looking at decision making. Now, Let's examine some of the factors that can influence decisions, not usually for the better. Both physical and social factors can influence your decisions. However, by far the largest number of the factors deal with psychology. The list of psychological factors covers the next 4 slides, so you can see that there is a lot going on in your decision making and, mostly you are completely unaware of these factors. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of these factors. I'll just make a few comments about themselves on their piloting skills. They almost always rate themselves as better than average. This is a widespread observation, and not limited just to pilots. There have been many studies that have reported that people generally feel themselves to be above average. While they tend to overestimate their personal capabilities, they also tend to underestimate the demands of situations and the likelihood that something bad, for instance an accident, will happen to them. Recall the model I showed you earlier in which response selection was affected by our estimation of our personal capabilities. If you seriously overestimate your capabilities and underestimate the demands of a situation, bad things are likely to follow. Related to the concept of self-serving bias are the notions of risk perception and risk tolerance. Risk perception refers to your estimation of the amount of risk present in a situation, while risk tolerance refers to the amount of risk you are willing to undertake in pursuit of a particular goal. Clearly, if your self-serving bias leads you to discount the demands of a situation and overestimate your capabilities, then that will lead you to underestimate the amount of risk in a situation. Previous research has shown that risk perception is a significant factor in accident involvement among pilots. If you underestimate the risk, then you may blunder into situations beyond your capabilities. The good news is that risk perception is the factor that can most easily be modified, since it is mainly a matter of having knowledge both about the hazards of flying and of your own capabilities. The more you know about the world and about yourself, the more accurate your estimates of the risk present in situations will be. Risk tolerance, however, is generally considered more of a personality trait, and so it is very difficult to modify. If you accurately estimate the risks of a particular situation as high, but still elect to continue, then you have a high degree of risk tolerance. You might think that this would lead to a lot of accidents, but the research suggests that risk perception is much more important than risk tolerance. Few pilots engage in highly risky activities deliberately, without regard for the risks. Mostly, they do it because they did not know it was risky. Going into a situation with a strong preconception of what the problem and solution are can drastically impact decision making, since you have mentally eliminated a large number of other potential solutions. As an example, I recently spent 20 minutes looking for a particular spice in my pantry. I clearly remembered purchasing the spice, so I knew it was in there somewhere among all the other spices. But, I started my search with the certainty that it was in a cellophane container. After examining all the cellophane containers repeatedly, I decided that it must be in a rectangular white metal container, like most of the other spices. Again, I conducted a lengthy search in which I repeatedly examined all the white metal containers without finding what I wanted. Finally, I abandoned all my preconceptions about the shape, size, and color of the container, and examined every container. This resulted in my finding the spice sitting in the front row, literally inches from my face, after only a minute of search. In this case, although the container was metal, it was light brown. Had I not started my search with such a strong preconception regarding the container type and color, I would likely have found it almost immediately. I suspect almost everyone can think of similar experiences in their everyday lives. Now consider the consequences of preconceptions when trying to solve an aviation problem. Your preconception of what the problem may be can cause you to expend a lot of time and effort that could have been devoted to actually solving the problem. The difficulty is that preconceptions can be very compelling. You may well be totally convinced that you know what the problem is. I certainly was convinced that I knew what the spice container looked like when I started searching. And, it can be very difficult for you to break free of the preconception and broaden your problem search. Having another crew member can be a great help at that point. people have a strong tendency to look for information that confirms their own preconceptions. Imagine you want to make a cross-country trip to visit your brother, and when you talk with him he tells you that the weather is great. If you then get a weather briefing, you are more likely to pay attention to and remember the parts of the briefing that support your planned flight than those that would cause you to reconsider. Even the order in which you receive information is important. Information is weighted more strongly when it appears early in a series, even when the order is unimportant. For example, people form a more positive impression of someone described as intelligent, industrious, impulsive, critical, stubborn, envious than when they are given the same words in reverse order. Some research has shown that pilots are more likely to press on into deteriorating weather late in a trip compared to early. This is an example of loss aversion bias. Diverting late in the trip means the loss of all the time, fuel, and money spent to get to that point. However, if the weather is encountered shortly after taking off, then the loss is not very great, and pilots are more likely to turn around. The valence effect of prediction bias is similar to the self-serving bias mentioned earlier. In general, people have trouble estimating the likelihood of events, both good and bad. So, they tend to overestimate the likelihood of a sudden break in the weather that will allow them to take off, while they underestimate the likelihood of a sudden deterioration in the weather that will force them to make a diversion. The false consensus effect bias and projection bias are important factors in multi-crewed aircraft. Generally, we think that everyone sees things pretty much like we do and that we have the same attitudes, opinions, and outlooks. That can lead to some surprises on the flight deck, when one pilot discovers that the other pilot is not doing what she expected. In a recent survey of military aviators, a significant number of the pilots reported that during a previous flight they had discovered that they and the other pilot had a very different mental picture of what was going on in or around the aircraft. People differ in the degree to which they believe that luck, as opposed to personal ability and actions, plays a part in the outcome of situations. This is referred to as locus of control, and people who believe in a large component of luck or outside factors are said to have an external locus of control, while people who believe that luck and similar factors play little part in what happens to them are said to have an internal locus of control. Several studies have shown that pilots with an internal locus of control have fewer accidents than pilots with an external locus of control. Similar results have also been found for drivers and other groups. Finally, we could not talk about ADM without including a discussion of attitudes. I've placed them at the end of this list because, although we talk about them a lot, my research has shown that of the several psychological factors I have studied, attitudes have the least impact on general aviation pilot safety. The data show that locus of control is a more powerful indicator of pilot safety than attitudes. I suspect, but cannot prove since we have not done the research, that many of the other factors that I listed above, such as confirmation bias and self-serving bias, are also more important than attitudes. Now let's look at some of the physical factors. All of these factors can degrade your ability to make good decisions in a timely manner. Plus, mental conditions such as depression and stress will also adversely impact your decision making. If you are feeling down or stressed out, for any of a variety of reasons, you will not be at the top of your game when making decisions, particularly for complex, ill-defined problems. Almost everyone has experienced the feeling of fatigue that comes from lack of sleep, and the effects of fatigue on performance have been studied in a variety of settings, including driving, performing military command and control operations, and, of course, flying. These graphs show the effects of 17 to 25 hours of wakefulness. The graph on the left shows the increase in lapses in vigilance, such as missing an ATC call or failing to notice an instrument moving out of the green arc. The graph on the right shows the increase in errors in a simple tracking task, such as maintaining straight and level flight using your attitude indicator. For both types of measures, the negative effects of lack of sleep are pretty clear. And, even though people tend to perk up toward the end of the study, they are still performing well below normal. The message here is pretty simple: get your sleep before you fly. Here are the results from a study of 8 experienced pilots who flew a series of approaches and landings in a simulator with the characteristics of a general aviation light twin. One half of the subjects were under the influence of low blood alcohol levels. Subjects in the alcohol condition showed significant deteriorations in their performance, as measured by deviations from the optimum approach speed or the optimum glide slope, when performing an instrument approach or when performing an asymmetric, single-engine, approach. This really should not be a surprise, since the effects of alcohol on both physical coordination and decision-making are pretty well known. Hence, the FAA rules about bottles and throttles. So you have a little cold, but you don't feel that bad and you decide to go fly anyway. Well, here are the results from a study that investigated performance changes resulting from upper respiratory tract infections, colds. Those who developed a cold had significantly faster, but less accurate, performance than those who remained healthy. Spatial disorientation is defined as a pilot's failure to correctly sense the position, motion, or attitude of his or her aircraft or himself or herself with respect to the surface of the Earth. When balance and orientation are unstable, there is a natural tendency to direct all mental resources to regaining orientation and stability. This prioritization could draw on resources and, as a result, degrade secondary tasks. If you are fighting the leans, perhaps because of that little head cold that you ignored, you are not going to be able to pay 100% attention to all the other aspects of aviating, navigating, and communicating. This slide shows the effects of hypoxia on errors, on the left slide, and reaction time, on the right side. Reacting and thinking get progressively more difficult the higher we get. Hence, the FAA rules about oxygen above 10,000 feet. It should also be noted that performance changes may occur considerably below 10,000 feet. For example, effects on your night vision occur at much lower altitudes. Also, if you have a compromised respiratory system, perhaps due to smoking or, once again, that nasty little cold, then you may not be able to absorb oxygen as efficiently as the pilots in this study, and may start to experience performance decrements at a much lower altitude. We often fail to take into account that humans are very social animals. That is, we generally like being around other people, and we like them to like us. In order to maintain that social relationship, we have evolved a very keen sense that enables us to detect what others expect of us. People who are unable to figure out what everyone wants of them tend to go live in cabins in the woods. Psychologists say that people tend to behave in accordance with the perceived expectation of other. That is, we behave like we think others expect us to behave. That works really great most of the time, but it can also lead to some problems. For example, a new pilot may observe that the old pilot that most of the other pilots look up to is a bit of a risk-taker, is kind of sloppy at pre-flight planning, and is not above bending the rules when needed to complete a mission. He comes to the not unreasonable belief that this is the sort of behavior that is expected of pilots in this organization, and modifies his own behavior to fit that model. This is not a good thing. So, we need to realize that our behavior and decisions are being constantly shaped by the people around us, while at the same time we are shaping them. Picking a good role model, and being a good role model, is important, and if you notice that the heroes in your organization seem to be skating on thin ice rather frequently, perhaps it is time to look for a job elsewhere, or to have a serious talk with your flying club's safety pilot. So, how do we improve decision quality? That is, how do we do better ADM? Well, there are 3 basic ways in which we can improve. We can expand our knowledge, we can sharpen our decision-making processes, and we can acquire new skills so that we have more options open to us. Probably the best way to improve your decisions is to improve your knowledge. Recall that earlier I said that poor risk perception was a major cause of accidents. Mostly, this is simply because pilots lack the knowledge to recognize the risks they are running in various situations. Knowing more means you can better assess the risks and can avoid or mitigate those situations that carry high risk. Besides technical knowledge about, for example, weather or your aircraft, you also need to improve your knowledge about yourself. recall those several pages of psychological factors that can influence your decision-making, and our model that shows that attitudes, and other factors such as locus of control and risk perception play an active part in shaping our assessment of situations and our selection of an appropriate response. Finally, you need to examine your own history. One of the strongest predictors of future behavior is past behavior. So, if you did risky things in the past, you are probably going to do risky things in the future. If you have a tendency toward close calls, then you should be aware of that and consider modifying your practices to curb that tendency. Perhaps all you need is a bit of training with a good instructor. Just as there are tests of weather knowledge, there are also tests that measure your attitudes, personality traits, and behavioral history. Links to those tests are given at the end of this presentation. Besides expanding your knowledge, you can also improve the process you use to make decisions. There are two broad methods for doing that. First, you could consider adopting one of the algorithms for decision making. These are primarily designed for relatively inexperienced pilots, in my opinion someone with less than 2,000 hours, and help you by setting up a standardized method for processing information. There are many guides to these methods, and a few links are provided at the end of the presentation. You can also take a more generalized approach. For example, the research at The Ohio State University that produced the knee-jerk and progressive decision-making pilot types also resulted in the production of a short training course to help pilots learn more effective decision-making skills. Take a look at your style of decision-making, and see if you make knee-jerk decisions, or whether you continue to refine and improve your decisions. Another generalized approach would be to create packages of predetermined decisions for various situations that you might face. For example, you might make a fairly detailed set of plans for dealing with low visibility in the area of your home airport. This would include specific triggers for action based upon the weather conditions, and a variety of alternatives that could be put into action. By reducing the problem to a set of if-then questions, you can reduce the need for in-flight decision-making. In this way you can mimic the recognition-primed decision-making of experts by having created a set of virtual memories and responses beforehand. If you improve your skills, then you will increase the range of options open to you. You also increase the probability of successfully executing a decision. Additional training beyond that required for a certificate is available from a variety of sources. These include flight training with a qualified flight instructor, internet-based training with the FAA, AOPA, or through my own website. And, of course, safety seminars presented by the FAA and other organizations are also a great place to pick up information about local flying conditions. Finally, you should also check your decision-making skills. The final slide in the presentation contains a link to an online pilot judgment test that my research has shown to be significantly related to accident involvement. A good flight review should not just assess whether you can take off and land the aircraft, but should also assess whether you can make good decisions regarding when and where to fly. Be sure that your instructor covers this aspect when assessing your proficiency as a pilot, since poor decision-making is much more likely to result in a fatal accident than poor crosswind landing skills. Finally, if you belong to a flying club, use your club members to set up hypothetical problems, and have each pilot come up with a solution. Then, compare your solutions and discuss the merits and drawbacks of each solution. This could be a good way of getting a discussion going about decision-making that will let you and other pilots benefit from the collective experience of the whole group. After all, if you all pool your experiences, collectively you may have as much experience as a 10,000-hour expert. Decision-making is a complex process that can be viewed in a variety of ways, and which is subject to a large number of influences. To improve your ADM, you need to improve your knowledge and skills, understand the factors that influence decisions, and understand just how your own tendencies and skills are impacting your decisions. Once you understand your own capabilities, the capabilities of your aircraft, and the demands of the situation, you can take steps, such as setting personal minimums, to manage your decision-making and the risks of aviation.